Hello, Christian Caryl. We are here today to talk about your terrific new book, Strange Rebels, 1979 and the Birth of the 21st Century. I'm going to let you explain in a second why it is that 1979 was really the crucial hinge point to history. But let me first start out with a little bit of explanation for what I think is a really unusual book that you've done. I know it's a real labor of love, but Christian, for those of you joining us today, is a longtime Newsweek foreign correspondent, contributor to the New York Review of Books, as well as my colleague who contributes to Foreign Policy magazine, where I'm the editor-in-chief. And you know, I think you've done something very unusual with this book, which is that you've managed to do, in a way, the impossible of linking together in one place Margaret Thatcher and the Ayatollah Khomeini as characters in a unified narrative about the great counter-revolutionary year of 1979. And it is your very provocative thesis that this was a year in which basically the backlash or the return of markets and religion to global politics in a big way signaled a counter-revolution toward the reactions of the earlier post-war era. How did you come up with that? Who could possibly write a book that says, what do Margaret Thatcher, Deng Xiaoping, the Ayatollah Khomeini, the Afghan communists, and the Iranian revolutionaries have in common? Never mind Pope John Paul II and the resurgence of religion as a factor in Polish national life, which is a whole fascinating part of the book. How did you come up with putting these things together?
Well, it had a lot to do with my reporting in Afghanistan after 9/11. You were there too. We actually, if memory serves me, we actually stayed in the same house for a while. You were with Washington Post, I was with Newsweek. And that house kind of struck me at the time. It had this shag carpeting and these tubular light fixtures. It was a ranch-style house. It was just like the kind of houses that we were growing up in the 70s when I was a kid. And I was kind of struck by that. When you went outside in Kabul, you were driving around in 1970s American cars, sometimes with 8-track tape players in them, if you can remember what those were. All the ministry buildings, the government buildings, were built in the 1970s. And then when you went to the bookstore in Kabul, you found all of these great postcards and books about Afghanistan in the 1970s. And what all of this showed was that Afghanistan was actually an up-and-coming country in the 1970s. It was really going somewhere. And then at the end of the 1970s, wham, it hits a wall, and history starts running in reverse, as it were. And the more time I spent in Afghanistan, the more I found myself wondering about that. We shouldn't take this as a self-evident thing when an entire country goes into reverse. And during my reporting over the past couple of years, I began to notice similar things in other places. And I began connecting the dots and just thinking about what happened at the end of the 1970s. And I realized that if you look at it globally, it's a very, very important moment. We tend to focus in the United States on the 60s. Western Europeans tend to focus on the 60s. But if you look at it from a global perspective, I don't think it looks quite that way. My book was kind of an exploration, kind of an attempt to figure out why this was so.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's take the five and tick them off pretty quickly here. So you have Afghanistan, yes, as you mentioned, and I always thought that house, to me, looked like the Brady Bunch. It is literally a copy of the house in the Brady Bunch with the open staircase, you know, that the family would come down in the opening scene of the Brady Bunch, and yet it had been most recently occupied before Newsweek took it over by Al-Qaeda leaders, or at least that's what we were told. I guess it made it seem more glamorous. But it's a great point that you make. So Afghanistan and the communist takeover of Afghanistan, which happened in 1979. China, the rise of Deng Xiaoping and his beginning of a turn towards the markets and an end to Mao and his cultural revolution. Poland, as we mentioned, the election of the Polish Pope John Paul II and his return to his homeland and sort of the precursor of the Solidarity movement. Great Britain, the election of Margaret Thatcher, and the real tumult over the British economy that I think has been really lost as part of the historical narrative of Britain after Thatcher. So I'm looking forward to coming back to that. And then number 5, of course, the one probably that most people think of first when they think of 1979, the Iranian Revolution, the toppling of the Shah and the hostage crisis in 1979. Wow, that's an awful lot of ground to cover. Let's start with Thatcher. There's just been huge outpourings of tributes to Thatcher on the occasion of her death, magazine covers and revisiting. Your book takes apart some of the myths of Margaret Thatcher.
Well, I tried to do that. It's always a challenge because you want to show why somebody is worth knowing about in the first place, right? There have been a lot of revisionist histories of Thatcher, a lot of people correcting some misperceptions about her. But of course, first you have to establish why she was important in the first place. And I think very few people would dispute that she was hugely, immensely important. But like any hugely important figure, transformative figure, she has generated a lot of myths. There are many myths about her. And for example, we think of her, American conservatives now think of her as this kind of icon of conservatism. Well, guess what? She was in favor of national health insurance. She never seriously tried to dismantle the national health system in Britain because she knew how popular it was. She voted for the law when she was in Parliament before she became Prime Minister. She voted for the law decriminalizing homosexuality in Great Britain. She never interfered with gun control. When she had a chance, she voted for abortion. So these social issues in which, Britons are sometimes have very different opinions than American conservatives, she doesn't look really like a traditional conservative at all. I think one of the most interesting stories, in fact, is her relationship with Ronald Reagan. There is no question that she and Reagan were very close. They really adored each other, but they were both very intense and intent when it came to defending the national interests of their respective countries. And make no mistake, Margaret Thatcher, even when it came to Ronald Reagan, was not shy about defending her national interests.
Well, she wasn't shy about much, right? So it's really on the economy in many ways that I think her legacy kind of rises or falls, according to your account of it.
Yes. For example, we live now in a world where it's taken for granted that capital can flow across boundaries almost without any barriers at all. Mm-hmm. And one of the very first things that she did when she became Prime Minister was she dismantled capital controls in Great Britain. There was a period in Britain when if you wanted to leave the country, you had to fill out a form and then they would give you 50, francs or something if you were going to France. You actually had this whole bureaucratic procedure. And she did away with all that. And that was an important prerequisite for what came later, the Big Bang, the huge deregulation project that turned London into a European and global financial center. Mm-hmm. But we take all this stuff for granted today, right? We just assume that this is kind of a given. We assume that, big companies multinational corporations shouldn't be owned by governments, right? And this is another legacy of hers that I think endures to this day. Other parts of her legacy perhaps haven't endured because we face such different conditions. Austerity, I think, is a good example. She was very, very austere in her financial policies, and those sorts of policies are really coming under attack a lot nowadays. So I think economically she was hugely important in shaping this market-oriented world that we live in today, but by no means have all aspects of her legacy remained in place. Mm-hmm.
Although it is striking how much she's invoked as sort of the patron or the modern patron of austerity politics, and it may well be a reason that her successor, David Cameron, the current leader of Great Britain, embarked upon that path, that painful path, as a response to the financial crisis of 2008. I mean, she's been much invoked, even if actually the conditions of today bear almost no resemblance to the kind of massive labor strikes and heavily nationalized economy that she was dealing with in 1979.
Exactly. Yeah. People forget, for example, that she did reduce the punitively high rate of personal income tax in Britain. At that time, it was 83%. Yeah, no. Incomprehensible, right? No country, as far as I'm aware, has a personal income tax rate like that today. But at the same time, she raised taxes on consumption because she believed in balanced budgets. She was actually willing to raise taxes to make the books balance. And in this, she was quite different from Ronald Reagan, who allowed enormous deficits to build up, and this was actually quite a source of friction between the two.